So let's have a look at the danger of appeasement in our church, in our life of faith, our life with God. The first sphere of danger is marriage. The church has always taught that marriage has a purpose, and the purpose of marriage is procreation, the transmission of life. And in the so-called pastoral approach of the last, let's say, 50, 40 years, the emphasis has shifted from procreation to things like communion, sharing, unity, affection, loving exchange of emotion and gifts. The complementarity, the loving complementarity of man and woman, that's what seems to have been most important. And the fact that there can be kids, it has become, in other words, fertility, it has become like a side effect, pleasant or unpleasant, but it has become a side effect of marriage. Whereas in the traditional teaching of the Church, the purpose of marriage is procreation. It is the co-responsibility of man and woman in their faithfulness, their co-responsibility with the Creator of transmitting life. That doesn't mean that man and woman have to produce kids, but they have to create the conditions under which God can create, in an act of divine omnipotence, He can create a human soul. That's a very grave, serious responsibility before God. And that's the way in which the purpose of marriage is procreation. Now, I realize it very well that it's very tempting to not talk about the kids in the first place, but talk about the love, the communion, the affection, especially to young people. Because, of course, when a couple comes to a priest and say we want to marry, they think that their love is the most perfect one in the world and is maybe the only real love in the world. That's a good start for a marriage. But when they go to a priest, the priest should realize that he is representing God. He is representing the revelation of Jesus Christ. The priest is not there to confirm to a girl and a boy or a man and a woman that their love is no doubt the most perfect one in the world. But he has to, in the first place, he has to remind them that the communion of man and woman means they are responsible before God of their capacity to transmit life. The purpose of marriage is the transmission of life, founding a family. Talking about love, communion, unity, exchange, accompaniment, it sounds great, and it is great. The thing is, these are properties of all friendships. All human friendships between men, between women, they imply some kind of communion, some kind of love, some kind of faithfulness. And they imply also the bodily presence in this world. They all imply that. That's not unique to marriage between man and woman. You can have a sense of communion, although a different one, between friends who have been at war together, between soldiers who have risked their life together and who have saved each other from violent death. Of course, there is a bond of friendship that is indestructible. Between mothers who have given life, of course, there is a communion of emotion and an understanding of their common experience. There is a compassion which people who have not been pregnant, in particular of course men, will not understand. And also between people working together, just being creative together, having to produce some kind of result, of course there's a friendship, there's a bond. There are many ways that people can love each other, can have a bond of friendship. And it all implies these things like community, some kind of productivity, of fertility, some kind of secret, but also some kind of intimacy that has to do with the human body. So in all friendships, you see these aspects of communion, unity, and some kind of fruitfulness. That's because we all, as human individuals, we are incomplete. We are not complete. We need other people to complete us. That's the big challenge of life. Can I find people that I can trust, that can complete me, and that I can also make more complete? This incompleteness is the beginning of all friendships. And then as friendship grows, there's another incompleteness. Or actually, at the core of every friendship between incomplete persons, there is another incompleteness. No friendship is perfect. Every friendship needs a purpose that is beyond the two persons that are friends. That is beyond the team that forms a group of friends, a band of brothers or sisters. So there is two kinds of incompleteness that are like matter for friendship, that are the conditions for friendship. The incompleteness of the human individual, and also the incompleteness of friendship itself. Individuals need each other, and individuals that need each other do need a purpose beyond themselves. And of course, in marriage, this purpose is the cooperation with God to give new life, to create by the marital act, by their sexuality, the sexuality of being man and woman, to create the conditions in which God, the Almighty, can create a new soul. And for other friendships, there are other purposes, whether it is just a very normal victory in a football game, or victory in the extremely serious business of war, or the friendship between colleagues who want to realize some kind of project together. Every friendship needs a purpose. So, if you want to specify marriage, you have to look at its particular specifying purpose. Now, what is the purpose of the marital act? What is the purpose of the sexual acts of man and woman? I'm not going to explain to you, you just have to consult a medical dictionary explaining what organs are all about. And if you're really ignorant, just find a medical encyclopedia with pictures. But if you just look with common sense at the human body, you see that the sexual organs, the genitals, are made for procreation. And so it is just a matter of common sense to say that marriage is for procreation, because its communion has the specific expression of the marital act, the unity physically between man and woman. Now, this purpose of marriage must not be ignored, and it must not be denied, and it must not be neglected, because it involves an extremely radical physical intimacy, and it implies also an extremely radical vulnerability of the child that is conceived. There's nothing more vulnerable in this world than a human child. So it has the absolute right, the natural right, to be received by parents that do not question its presence, except maybe in asking, how is our child an image of God? A child is a gift of God. Life is given. Life is not produced. Life is not a product of technology. Life is a gift of God, because only God can create a spiritual soul. And because of this incredible physical, natural vulnerability of the child, and the radical intimacy of man and woman in the act of procreation, the secrecy must be respected, and marriage must be based on absolute and exclusive faithfulness. And that's what's implied in the purpose of marriage, which is procreation, cooperation with the Almighty God. Now, when in discussions about marriage, or in catechesis, or in teachings about marriage, when the accent, the emphasis shifts from procreation to the other aspects of marriage, like the loving emotions, the communion, the exchange, the accompaniment, when the accent is no longer in the first place on the procreation, then there can be terrible consequences. First of all, for all other friendships. Because of the extremeness, the radicality of the physical union between man and woman, if the purpose is not specifically procreation in marriage, then suddenly all other friendships are devalued, because they do not imply this very intimate and secret unity of the bodies. Suddenly all other friendships are lesser. They are inferior to marriage, and marriage becomes like the archetype of all loving relationships, which is wrong, especially on a spiritual level. That's the first consequence. Other friendships lose their radical meaning, or can lose their truly spiritual, human and divine nature. A second consequence is actually a consequence of that first consequence, is then that in order to re-value other kinds of friendships, they are seen in a sexual light. Because of the romanticization of marriage, there can be a sexualization of other friendships. The bond between women who have been pregnant suddenly becomes a lesbian bond. Or guys who've been at war together, or who have won a football match together, who have produced a car together, suddenly their friendships are seen as also a kind of homosexual relationship or whatever. That's how the term bromance was invented. So the idea of friendship is distorted. It is warped by the fact that the marriage between man and woman becomes the archetype of all friendships. There is a third consequence of the outright denial of fertility and procreation as the purpose of marriage, in that man and woman are no longer sure about their identity. As a consequence, and we see it today, we see that man and woman have incredible identity problems. In fact, when you look at it, man is not just a man because he needs a woman, and woman needs man. And woman is woman not just because she needs a man and man needs her. But ultimately, woman is a woman because a child needs a mother. And man is a man because a child needs a father. You may not like that, but that's the way nature is constructed. We cannot be green, if you like. We cannot be ecological if we deny the wisdom of being man and woman with respect to the child. If fertility and the founding of the family is no longer seen as the primary goal of marriage, the purpose, the finality of marriage, then of course you end up with men and women having terrible identity problems. Man and woman no longer know who they are, and they no longer know who they can become before God. Now I am afraid that I don't have to warn for this kind of appeasement with the sexual revolution, because I can just observe that it has been going on for a long time already, and we can see the consequences in our world today. This appeasement has been going on for far too long. We see in our world today, in our world civilization, in our global civilization, we see attacks on human fertility that have never been seen before in the history of mankind. The attacks and the perversion of human fertility that we see today is unprecedented. Mankind has never seen anything like this. We see identity problems that cause people, even in their adolescence, to mutilate themselves. And they're being helped by others, making money from it, to mutilate themselves. In many countries, we see an implosion of population. A whole generation is just missing because there have been no children. The population crunch is one of the main threats to human civilization for our common future. And I'm afraid we have to add to that there is a generation which does exist, which hasn't received any education of some sorts. It is unprepared to face the world of tomorrow. You cannot catch up with an education that has not been received, in the same way that you cannot replace a generation that does not exist. And finally, what are we going to do with 100 million men in China, in Pakistan, in India? Because of selective abortion, there's a surplus of 100 million men. Now, what are these men going to do? How are they going to behave? Given the fact that a lot of young men find wisdom when attaching themselves to a woman, to marry a wife, and find purpose in life by giving life. What's going to happen in these countries? One is Islamic, one is communist, and one of those countries, India, has a very ancient form of paganism, which means that one country has the unique God, Allah, one country has many gods, and one country has no God at all. What are these 100 million men going to do in the near future? That's an open question. Unfortunately, it's not a rhetorical question. It's a real question. And we have to ask that question as a consequence of this attack on human fertility that is unprecedented in human history.